protest. Why was a demonstration an effective protest for you? And why does it look in the film that we now see like kids being loud and police being mean? That's what you basically see, and that's all that anybody really understands about these things. Was this effective? Was it fun? Was it pleasant? Was it good? They look a certain way today, and I'm trying to get below it a little bit. When you look at them, you see what look to be kids having fun, a lot of hippie-looking kids, not all, but a lot, and police being mean and scary. How do you remember it?
The years of protest were dramatic only because they had been preceded by so many years of quiescence or acquiescence. The noises that we made just in coming together in large numbers in the middle 60s and making speeches over sound systems in the great out of doors, these scenes were impressive and dramatic only because they hadn't been seen before. And I think they spun out their usefulness rather quickly, so that as successive generations moved into the anti-war movement, it became almost a psychological requirement that they find yet another step to take. What, another demonstration? The next one had to be bigger, badder, and maybe inexorably the movement pushed and pulled itself towards more violent encounters, in the same way that those forces in the society that opposed what we were doing also escalated towards violence. But the impact of those demonstrations was never greater than with the 1965 March on Washington to protest the war. Actually, there were two that year, in April and another one in November. The April one, there were 30 or 40 or maybe 50,000 people, something like that same number, maybe a few more, 10, 60,000 in November. The feeling that it had to be bigger, otherwise it would be a defeat. And the one after that had to be bigger yet, the mass mobilizations of 66, 67. They all had to be bigger. If they didn't get bigger, then the other side would say, your movement isn't growing, you've crested, you've peaked, you're falling back. So there was a constant sense that the demonstration, which had rather inexpensively made a big point in the beginning, became more and more expensive as time went by, requiring logarithmically greater numbers of people, even to hold par, even to just keep the momentum up. And also as time went by, and the debate about the war polarized people who had previously been indifferent or ignorant of their beliefs. As sides began to be chosen up in a more rigorous and demanding way, and as people worked out their views, left and right and center, the level, the temperature went up. Also, more and more people were involved in the war itself. There were steadily larger numbers of American troops going over to fight the Vietnam War.
There's a lot of angriness, Carl, and what I see in the footage I'm looking at, people are yelling at each other all the time.
Yeah.
I have whole hour films of yelling. Describe that time. It seems to be very frustrating. Everybody seems angry.
I remember it as being a period where people in the youth movement against the war felt very much on the spot in a situation that was brand new and increasingly scary and serious. I think it's odd, for one thing, that the American protest of the war in Vietnam had to be led by a student organization. Where were the grown-ups? Well, they were there, but they were a long time getting their act together. They were a long time showing up. If they had showed up earlier and been a part of the thing from the beginning, I don't know that it would have ever had to become as bitter as it did. But we basically had a movement that was injected, or that injected itself into a very grown-up, very serious situation, and yet was manned and directed by inexperienced people. And each of the succeeding levels of inexperienced leadership, taking over from the previous group, felt obliged to come up with the new strategy, the new tactic, the new gesture, the new explanation that will get us over the next bit of horizon, so that we go from being very much committed to nonviolence in the period 64-65 to 1968, where the leadership goes over to the group that will become the Weathermen, who were committed almost on principle to escalating the level of struggle, making it more violent, carrying a violence to the culture. And what was necessary now, these people thought, was the creation of some kind of organization capable of operating underground, outside the law. The slogan was a line from one of Bob Dylan's songs, "To live outside the law, you must be honest." The corollary of that for the Weathermen organizers was, to be honest, you must live outside the law. To be serious, you must break the law of the imperialist mother country. So they started trying to teach themselves how to do it. And they knew they didn't know how to do it. They knew that they were half silly, and that's why the peculiar quality of the Weatherman phenomenon is that the Weathermen, to a certain extent, laughed at themselves. Of course, the laughter became tears. Real blood was shed. But one of the Weatherman kids who was killed in a townhouse explosion in 1970, Terry Robbins, was a great fan of the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. You remember a movie about a couple of outlaws who for a long time can get away with anything. They have so many cute tricks. Suddenly, there's a guy chasing them who they can't outfox. And the one Butch keeps saying to the other Sundance, looking back, who are those guys? Mingling of fear and admiration. The Weathermen felt the same thing. Who are those guys? They knew they had attracted the big shots. The big boys were coming after them. The ones that the Weathermen would never be able to outfox or outwit or outlast or outorganize. They knew they were done for. They had a real quality of fatalism and death about them. But they thought they had to, nevertheless, they had to go ahead and do what they were doing, which came to building bombs. Because legitimate politics had been destroyed by America, spelled with a K. Legitimate politics had been destroyed by the outwardly legitimate system itself.
Was it scary?
Yeah, and it was scary to me, and it was scary to everybody I knew. And a lot of us on the inside of the movement thought that it was the stupidest damn thing that we could come up with, was the idea of more violence. But I think that for a while, the feeling was that it's like the cartoon where the big guy is saying, let me at him, let me at him, or the little guy is saying that, and the big guy is sort of holding him back. And we felt like that little guy who was saying, let me at him, somebody our dad was holding us back. He understood. He would make sure that the scene didn't get out of hand. But then they killed Martin Luther King and they killed Bobby Kennedy. I say they, that mystic they. Your dad wasn't there anymore. There was nobody to hold you back. There was no front movement of grown-ups who had probity and the depth of understanding to keep the scene cooled out to the extent that it needed to be. And the youth movement was suddenly left alone with its rhetoric, It's very fierce face-making, and an adversary who wasn't at all backwards about taking it to the mat. If King had stayed alive, King would in some way have been a part of that. The civil rights movement and the anti-war movement would have folded together behind a legitimate, grown-up, and responsible leadership with serious opportunities in the electoral political dimension. And that's what would have happened. Kennedy would have become the president. I don't know if King would have come into his cabinet or not, but he would have been somehow a figure in official Washington. The civil rights movement and the anti-war movement would have succeeded in achieving what they were shooting for in nonviolent terms, just by the process of bringing a debate to the country, of forcing the discussion of issues that incumbent politicians just wanted to lay aside. We would have won a legitimate victory. But when King and Kennedy were snuffed out just on the threshold of that victory, there was suddenly nowhere to turn. And people got frightened, they got angry. People in the movement started saying, hey, look, we wondered all along if the other side would allow us a legal victory. The more pessimistic and radical among us had been saying all along that the other side would never allow a legal victory, that at the last minute something would be done to preempt the movement if it ever did threaten to become victorious on its own nonviolent terms. That something was those two assassinations. And they left us exposed, they left us leaderless, they left us to our own devices, to our own rhetoric, and it seemed to I would say, the best and the brightest of that generation, that the only honest thing for them to do, the only honorable thing to do, was to find some way to fight that fire with an equivalent fire. If the other side was going to destroy our legitimate leaders, then there was no soul left in legitimate politics, and we would have to go outside the given and outside the legitimate. Maybe you could say it this way. In those days, back way long ago in the 1960s, when dinosaurs roamed the earth, I thought that a faith in representative government and constitutional democracy was widely shared and taken as a matter of course by the population at large. These days, I don't think that. It's not a majoritarian point of view. It's a minority faith. And it's a hope for the future. A belief in American democracy these days must be a belief that in the future democracy will succeed. It must be a faith that in the future people will learn, we people will learn that we have to conduct our own affairs or we will have those affairs conducted for us. So it's a faith that people can become small d Democrats, small r Republicans. Whereas before, it was a faith that people already were of that disposition. I now see democracy and true republicanism as a forward-looking project for political action and not as a set of conditions that can be taken for granted.